Number 4. In 2003, I was a senior in college. I had the opportunity to travel to Chicago to work at an international trade show for my family business. Trade shows are all about getting new customers, and this particular show brings in tens of thousands of potential customers from every corner of the world who may be needing some industrial equipment, conveyors, case erectors, robots, etc. When I'm working at one of these things, I have to be outgoing, perky, and friendly. So when anyone would walk by, I would attempt to engage them in conversation, because conversations turn into leads, and leads turn into sales. Except when the only thing the guy wants to buy is a bride. It was the second day of the show, and my dad and the other salesmen were off getting lunch when a very short, unattractive man in his mid-60s stops by our booth. I engage him, and we discuss his industry, pharmaceuticals. I scanned his badge, and then he didn't leave. Instead, he started complimenting me. And me being 19 and working my first show, I didn't quite know what my boundaries were yet. I took the compliments as gracefully as I could and tried to direct him down a more business-related topic. It didn't work. He started obviously leering and telling me how well off he was and how I would make a great wife. But after about 15 minutes and other customers coming up, he picked up one of my dad's business cards and left. I thought that was that. I laughed about this later with one of the guys across the aisle, and even with my dad, until that night, when my dad's cell phone started ringing and the call was for me. My Prince Charming had called every hotel associated with the show until he found where we were staying and was waiting outside the hotel in a limo. He explained that he wanted to take me to dinner so that he could talk to me about taking me back to Jordan with him and becoming his wife. Me still being stupidly concerned about alienating a future customer, I told him that I had dinner plans and that I couldn't meet with him. He said,
"Fine, tomorrow then."
We argued back and forth about it for a minute, and I eventually told him something along the lines of, "No, that wouldn't be appropriate. I have dinner plans with vendors all week." Then I hung up, and Dad ignored a few missed calls from him. I was mercilessly teased about my Jordanian husband at dinner. However, when the guy showed up at the booth again the next day with an entourage and tried to negotiate an honest-to-God marriage contract with my dad, it wasn't quite as funny. I'm not sure what exactly my dad said to him, but we didn't sell any conveyors to the creepy pharmaceutical plant owner from Jordan, and I still get nervous about seeing him at shows. Number 3. I work in retail and I have a very unique name. This happened a few years ago when I first started. I work at a 24-hour convenience store, and at this point, I was working the graveyard shift. I'm used to all types of unsavory folks, but there was this one guy who left me very unsettled. It was about 3 a.m., and unfortunately I was working alone because my coworker decided to call out the last minute. The store was dead, and I was packing out a delivery when he walked in. He was a short, stocky black guy, a little older than me, probably late 20s to early 30s. I looked up from the task at hand and greeted him with a friendly smile and asked him if he needed help with anything. He grinned and looked me up and down, his brown eyes darkening with lust.
"Yes. Did you sell condoms?"
I nodded and pointed him to the health and beauty section and proceeded to make my way to the register. He browses for a bit, and typically, he picked up a box of Magnums and some of those herbal sexual supplement pills.
"So how are you tonight?"
he inquired. I told him I was fine, working hard and anxious to go home. His eyes traveled up and down my body, Settling on my name tag, which was pinned just beneath my left breast, I felt a little uncomfortable. I've never been comfortable with people staring at me, and his eyes lingered longer than necessary. He asked how to pronounce my name, and I tell him. He says it's nice, very politely. I say thank you and begin to scan and bag his items, trying to avoid eye contact. He then asked if I had a boyfriend. Truthfully, I say yes. He comments that he must be a lucky man, and he wishes that he could be in his shoes. Again, I smile uncomfortably, and as we're supposed to do, I asked him if he needed anything else.
Not unless I can have you.
Now I'm getting annoyed. I ignore his comment and proceeded to tell him his total. He swipes his card, I complete the transaction, and I tell him to have a good night. He thanks me and asks me if I'm working by myself. No, my coworker is downstairs doing some paperwork. I lied. He grins and says,
No, he isn't. I've been watching you since 12. I haven't seen another person here all this time. Are you afraid?
I frowned. You've been watching me? That's not creepy at all. I tell him that he needs to leave if he's done shopping, because I have work to complete. Once again, he laughs. I thought he was going to argue, but a group of drunken guys walk in, and he leaves. Later that night, I check my Facebook, and I have a friend request. Guess who it's from? Again, I have a very unique name. Only 2 people on Facebook have it. I block and delete the friend request. Next morning, as I'm walking to the subway station, the wanted poster on the token booth catches my eye. The face is familiar. It was the creep from my store. He was wanted for sexual assault and battery. The incident happened more than a month ago. I told my manager, who called the police and gave them our tip. I don't know if he was ever caught, but please, let's not meet outside my store, and I still don't feel comfortable with name tags. Number 2. So this happened a while back when I was in my early 20s. I was working at a small retail store in my town's mall. It was coming up to the end half of the day, and I don't know how I noticed it, but an older man, probably in his 50s, I'm not sure, had walked past my store about 3 or 4 times. Not consecutively, just every now and again. I worked at one of those little custom jewelry stores, so it's odd for an older male to be walking past so many times, but I didn't think anything of it. It came closing time, and I had left to catch my bus home at about 6:30 p.m. I remember it was transitioning into winter, because it was dark out by then. I'm a very paranoid person, and I still live by the rules of stranger danger, so even now, when I leave work, I make sure I change into an outfit that's less fashionable. I don't like drawing attention to myself in any way possible, so I try to make sure I'm as covered up and as average looking as I can be. I don't know why, but I have that disease where I attract all the wrong attention for no reason at all. So as I said, I was waiting for my bus home, sitting by myself at the town center's bus terminal. And guess who walks past? The older man. At this point, I kind of felt uneasy, but in my head, I tried to make reason prevail, as many people take the buses all the damn time. My bus showed up and I got on, and well, you can guess who got on after me. I remember sitting at one of the seats facing inward, the ones for wheelchairs and prams, and he sat at the first seat above the steps. I remember staring forward, feeling his eyes burning into me. I kept trying to use my peripheral vision to see if he was looking at me, but not wanting him to know that I noticed him. The whole bus ride, I waited to see if he got off before my stop, thinking it was just my over-anxious paranoid mind working overtime. until I pressed the button for my stop. I waited until the last possible second to press it, and as I stood up, he did too. I went to walk to the front door of the bus, and he exited the rear. At that moment, as soon as he stepped off, I sat back down. I had no idea where the bus went after my stop, but I honestly didn't fucking care. I will never forget the look on his face as the bus drove off. I've never seen such hatred and anger in a person's face than I did through that window. His face is burnt into my memory like a photograph. It still absolutely terrifies me to this day. I have no idea what would have happened to me if I had gotten off at my bus stop that night, but I'm glad my paranoia was so intense that I didn't. Number 1. This happened a couple of years ago, back when I was a dancer at a gentleman's club in Virginia. It was the most upscale place in the city, but it still was more or less catered to the regular clientele. There was a man named George who used to come in and see me a couple of times every week. He would buy dances in VIP rooms and would always tip me very well, while saying things like, "I can't believe you don't have a boyfriend," and "When are you going to let me take you out to dinner?" The thing is, I did have a boyfriend. However, much like my real name, my personal life is not anyone's business, and strip clubs are a fantasy environment. If these men knew that I had a boyfriend and a life outside of dancing, I probably would not have made as much money as I did. One night I was getting dressed to leave, and I was excited to get home as my boyfriend had just come back from a tour he was on. He's in a band, and he was waiting at home for me. The club closed at 2 a.m., so I usually was walking out of the door and to my car around 2:30. Usually we have a bouncer that walks us out, but since it was a slow night, we only had one bouncer still on the clock, and he was off doing something. I was in a hurry, so I just ran to my car alone. As soon as I started up my car and turned out of the parking lot, another car turned its lights on and pulled out behind me. I didn't think too much of it and continued on my way home, until I realized that every turn I made, the car also made. He followed me onto the highway and onto my exit. My boyfriend and I lived on the outskirts of the city in a heavily wooded area, where houses are pretty few and far between. So as soon as the car took the same exit onto the gravel road that leads to the area my house is in, I called my boyfriend. Now, my boyfriend at the time was a really big guy, and he had a really bad temper. As soon as I pulled into our driveway, with the other car still behind me, he ran out from behind his tour van with a baseball bat and 2 of our dogs following close behind. He told me to stay in my car, so I was trying to see who was following me without actually getting out, and of course, it was George. My boyfriend managed to hit the hood of his car with a bat before George could reverse down the gravel road and disappear. I was scared because he knew where I lived now, but my boyfriend assured me that there was nothing to worry about anymore and that he had most likely adequately deterred George from ever coming back. I mean, I guess a huge tattooed guy with a baseball bat and 2 giant pit bulls is a pretty good deterrent. I told my managers at work about the incident the next day, and they banned George from the club. A couple of months later, he tried to come in, but the bouncer stopped him, and his only explanation was, "I thought that she didn't have a boyfriend." Hey guys, Unit 522 here, and I want to thank you very much for watching my video. I would appreciate it very much if you would share, like, and comment. And if you're new to this channel, become one with the Unity by hitting the subscribe button. If you have a scary story or experience that you want featured on this channel, you can always send it to my email or post it on the Free Horror Stories subreddit. The links for those can be found in the description below. If you would like to help out this channel even more, consider a PayPal donation. And for more updates, be sure to follow me on Twitter. There's nothing wrong with a little darkness in your life. As long as you never forget, there's always a reason to be afraid.
A few years ago, my best friend Jay and I decided to start exploring in the desert near a tiny statutory town close to our hometown with an immense expanse of land and an adjoining wild horse preserve. We were hooked immediately, both of us people who enjoy hiking and camping. This place seemed like heaven. It wasn't long before we found an amazing little campsite about 15 miles or so into the desert, far away from any light pollution and even cell phone signal. It's the perfect place with a small reservoir used in the late summer to water free-range cattle, an old corral, and a fire pit carved into the sandstone. We decided we needed to go camping as soon as possible, and planned on having our first camping trip a few days later on my days off. Jay and his SO met me out there with our dogs, and the first day was a ton of fun playing around the Book Cliffs high above the Grand Junction and sighting wild horses. We returned to camp late in the afternoon, and had a nice time cooking dinner and telling stories around the campfire. Soon darkness fell, and I began to become aware that I had been feeling uneasy. Not wanting to ruin the fun for my friends, I told them I was tired and needed to turn in. I returned to my tent with my 2 dogs and snuggled in, the feeling of unease tightening around my shoulders. I couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety, so I did what I do best and chose to ignore it, turning on a movie that I'd downloaded on my laptop. As the intro played to my movie, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I paused the film and stared behind me. I saw what looked like the bobbing of a flashlight behind our camp near the dirt road. The light danced for a few minutes before disappearing. I looked beside me and saw that my dogs were still sleeping peacefully and chalked it up to my imagination before returning to my movie. I must have fallen asleep because it wasn't long before Jay's SO was waking me up and asking me to come help calm Jay down. When I left my tent, my friend was visibly upset and shaken. He kept apologizing and asking if we could leave. He said he didn't know what was wrong, but that he needed to leave, that we needed to leave now. I told him that I'd been feeling incredibly uneasy, and watched all night, and we agreed to go. Taking only our dogs and pillows, we left our campsite, and drove the long 30 miles back home in the middle of the night. The drive back into the town was nerve-wracking. I had to keep glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure that my friend's car was still behind me. It took everything I had to keep my vehicle under 20 miles an hour so that I wouldn't ruin my car on the heavily rutted dirt roads, but it felt as though we were being chased away. The next day, Jay decided to go back for our things. Both his SO and I had to work that day, so he drove out to the campsite in the early afternoon. Everything was as it should be. No animals had touched our stuff or even tried to get into the cooler. But he said that he still felt watched, and as if something wasn't right. A few weeks later, a friend of Jay's was in town visiting and wanted to go camping, so Jay took him back to the spot near the reservoir. He said he experienced the same feeling laying there in his tent, his whole body screaming out in anxiety. He said all of his muscles were tense, and he had the overwhelming feeling that if he were to close his eyes, that something horrible would happen. So he left his tent, not wanting to wake his friend, and decided to take a stroll around the campsite. Before long, he found himself down by the reservoir. This is when he saw a small but brightly intense light darting and dancing back and forth, tucked into the valley below the Grand Mesa, going from east to west. It darted and whirled around. He said the feeling of fear and unease was so intense that he went back to his tent without watching to see if the light went away. We have both had a handful of odd experiences out there following these incidents. I've taken several friends and family members out there to experience the beauty. One summer I was seeing a guy who was interested in checking out the area, so I took him to a spot where we could park my car and explore near the Twin Peaks. We started walking up an oilfield admin road when I was overcome with the urge to climb up the sandstone rockfall at the base of the mountain. My friend followed me, and we hiked up until he found an opening to a cave. We peered in and found that the opening was more like a skylight. The bottom was a good 20 feet or so below us. We decided to look around and see if there was an actual entrance. After a bit of searching, we followed my dog to the entrance of the cave. It was low and slightly blocked off by fallen sandstones, so we had to get on our backs and inch in foot first. When we got in, we saw that we were only in a smaller antechamber, but the smell of something decaying and the feeling of unease we felt told us to leave, so we did. It was only after we got back into the car that I discovered I dropped my favorite vape. It's been 2 years since I lost it, but every time I'm around there, I have the overwhelming urge to return. On one occasion, my mom and I took our dogs out to the desert to run free. I took her to a cool rock outcropping that I call Castle Rock. We hiked up the rock structure and started to make our way around it when we noticed the base of this rock structure was littered with small bones of every variety. This creeped my mom out heavily, but I am sort of a goblin by nature, so I started picking through them for things to take home. My mom told me she didn't feel right, and wanted to walk back down to the Jeep. I told her to please hold on a minute, that I'd been wanting to check this place out, so she stayed while I hiked up the right side of the structure. I found some cool rocks, took some pictures, and enjoyed the view from the top of the rocks before heading down. When I got back to my mom, she was extremely upset, saying that she had been yelling for me the whole time, and that she couldn't find me anywhere. I laughed her off and told her that I was thirsty, so we returned to her Jeep. As soon as we got in, we noticed a volleyball in front of her vehicle. It was maybe 3 feet in front of her Jeep right where we had walked past, with no footprints or any indication as to how it had gotten there. There have been several other strange occurrences, but nothing ever really seems to happen. Only eerie feelings, occasional lights, and the sensation that someone is watching you. But I always manage to convince myself that there really isn't anything going on, besides an overactive imagination, and I always return. I'm incredibly drawn to the area, like nothing I've ever experienced before. I've even taken a couple of solo camping trips, despite being a single female by myself. But I always return, even after promising my best friend and my sister that I wouldn't go out there alone anymore. I always do. Jay refuses to go camping out there anymore, and it takes a great deal of effort to convince him to go explore anymore. Despite the fact that he has hitchhiked from Michigan to Colorado, done solo backpacking and more, he can't stand it. Beside the feeling of being watched when I'm out there, the fixation bordering on obsession with this place kind of makes me nervous. I always feel like I'm searching for something when I'm out there, leading me to go to new places and check out new areas. There has always been folklore around black crows and their cawing that my mother has always believed in. I've always been in love with anything creepy, so I bought into black crows aesthetically, but never actually believed that they served as an omen for death, as they're commonly known for. That was until I was told this story later in my life. My mother is from Central America and was born and raised there, only moving to the United States around 2000. She's always been superstitious. She would tell me when I was a kid to be careful around crows. Try not to let one fly in my path or disturb one, because they symbolize death and can predict it if someone in your life is about to die. I was just a kid, so, again, I never really believed any of that, and just promised to follow these rules to please her. It was still hot and sunny out when I was beginning elementary school, and my mother and father were at home painting our back deck as we had just moved into a new house. This was the first house that we lived in since my mother moved from Central America to the States. All of my mother's family were thousands of miles away from her. She was always worried that something would happen to someone in her family while she was gone. My father was on all fours painting the deck, and my mother had come outside to give him a drink when a black crow swooped down right over my father's head. My mother immediately began to panic and cry. Before my father had a chance to ask her what was wrong, the home phone rang. My mother picked up the phone, crying, and burst into Spanish asking, "Is it Dad?" and "What happened?" before she even knew who was on the other side of the call. It was my mother's family calling to tell her that her father had indeed just passed away. I came home that evening and my father explained that my grandfather had passed on, but he didn't tell me of the crow story. When I was a little older, my mother had told me the story and my father confirmed the order of the events. That story is so strange to me, and ever since then I, too, have been wary of crows and their presence in my life. My mother said that she just knew her father had died in that moment. When the phone rang, she knew she was getting the phone call. I find it interesting that the crow flew so low over my father, perhaps directly symbolizing that a father figure in someone's life had passed away. Where I live, around that time of year, a crow should have been nowhere in sight. There had not been any around that day, or for months even. All of it is just a little too bizarre and creeps me out to this day. So, I've always had hyper-realistic dreams. I also have always believed that my dreams are how God talks to me. I know that sounds a little crazy. Regardless, the other night I had a dream that I believe is a sign. I also should say that my walk in faith has been wavering in the past year, and I've also been going to see psychics a few times a year since last December. Anyway, to the dream. I believe I was on a road trip with a couple of my buddies. We stopped at a little diner in a small town that had a psychic, gimmicky store attached to it. I was waiting for my friends to use the bathroom, and when they both came out, they both said that they wanted to go and do a reading. I said all right, and that I would wait for them to be done. They went through this black-lit corridor through a purple-curtained doorway. They came back out not too long after, all smiling and cheerful. They told me that I should do a reading, but something didn't feel right. I've always been sensitive to energies in general, but there was something about this place. They kept tugging me when all of a sudden the psychic came out. Immediately, all the alarms were going off in my head. She came up to me and got really close to my face. She had these bulging eyes, and her face was full of super white makeup, really heavy eyeshadow and eyeliner. Her hair was a fire truck red, and slicked back into a bun with feathers and things sticking up. She was really freaking me out, but I was like, alright, whatever, so we start. She grabs me by the shoulders, and we make very intense eye contact, and she starts telling me a bunch of things like I have the gift, something that I already know. And we start backing away almost like a dance, and then we both get on all fours and drop down on our bellies, and she starts to slither toward me. Literally, slithering, without using her hands. This is when I know something is actually really up. I stop everything. I stand up, and am telling her that I'm done. She is still slithering toward me. She then slithers all the way up my body until her face meets mine. Then she says, "Let me show you the way." I say no. This makes her super angry, and she picks me up by my throat and keeps chanting, "Let me show you the way, let me show you the way." She starts running with me in her hand, and the room keeps elongating, so she keeps running. Then snakes start coming out of her sides, and they burrow into my skin. I feel the pain of them digging into me and biting me. I'm grabbing onto her wrists and I scream, "No! There is only one way. God is the way." And I scream this while making eye contact, and she starts screaming bloody murder. And I get the strength to gouge out her eyes with my thumbs. More snakes and spiders begin pouring from her eye sockets, and I scream that again, that God is the way. And that's when I woke up. I woke up this morning to some disturbing news. My wife and I sleep in different rooms, mainly because I snore a lot and I also toss and turn due to spinal issues. It works out best for us. Lately, I've been going to bed around 4 a.m. since I'm out of a job and I prefer the quiet of the night. My wife usually gets up anywhere between 5 to 6 a.m. if the cats are bugging her, to give them a little something until feed time. Don't ask me why, it's just what she does. Anyway, this morning after I woke up, she said as she walked past my room, she saw a shadow figure sitting on the corner of my bed, staring at me, and that my iPod was on. She also said she knew I was sleeping because I was snoring. Now, I usually watch something on my iPad before going to sleep, but I also keep my door mostly closed so that the light from the iPad doesn't disturb her. If she saw me, it means the door was open, as it would have been impossible otherwise. Now that part doesn't disturb me too much. We have 4 cats, and it's not out of the ordinary for them to push the door open. What I know 100% for a fact is that I had the door mostly closed, and the iPad was definitely in sleep mode. I always put my iPad in sleep mode, and then put my phone on the charger prior to going to sleep. My door creaks, so I would have heard it open if I were still up. This is disturbing to me because it isn't the first time a shadow man was spotted by my wife, and I spotted one before meeting her. Back in either 2008 or 2009, I was living in my first apartment. I had the scariest experience of my life. I woke up sleeping on my chest, which I never do, and I found my entire body was paralyzed. The only thing I could move was my eyes. Out of the corner of my left eye, I could see a shadow figure approaching me. I tried screaming, but nothing came out. I started to panic, and before I could do anything, everything went blank, and I woke up in the morning. I usually forget most of my dreams, but this event is scared into my brain. The last bit of information I want to share is something that seems odd to me, but I don't really know how to explain it. It's only happened twice in my room over the last 3 years. What I've seen is this strange, tan-colored dust that appears out of nowhere in a small area. The 2 times it happened, it wasn't in the same area, and oddly, the areas around the dust only have the typical normal dust buildup. I've checked the ceiling to see if anything came out from there, and found nothing. It's strange to me because, while I'm not a clean freak, the amount of dust makes it look like it's been building up over months, which, for that, wouldn't be the case. This may have had nothing to do with anything, but I thought it was worth mentioning. I've watched documentaries on sleep paralysis and read some medical reports. I don't know if it is or isn't a medical condition, but what gets me is that people from all over the world with various beliefs have experienced the exact same thing. Always the inability to move one's body, and always a single or multiple shadow figures. I am a female in her early 20s. I live in the US in a desert state, a town in the middle of nowhere. I come from a military family, generations of Air Force and Army, and a grandfather who was involved in Project Blue Book. I was sitting alone in my house, playing some Gwent on PS4, when my little sister and her friend came rushing through the door. I jumped out of my skin. It was midnight, and no lights were on. My sister, let's call her Yellow, and her friend Brown, seemed a bit shaken and nervous, though she and her friend were laughing as if they were up to no good. I asked them what they were doing, and Yellow said, "We were out for a walk in the desert near the mountain." Keep in mind, my sister is 16. No reason for her and her 15-year-old friend to be out in the desert in the middle of the night. I was upset, but saw they were fine, so I shook it off. "What did you guys do?" Yellow and her friend looked at each other and went quiet. Her friend whispered, "Do we tell her?" And Yellow replied, "Nah, she won't believe us." And they walked into the kitchen without a further word. Needless to say, I wanted to know what was going on, so I followed and promptly asked, "Yellow, what's up? Don't make me go nuclear." Going nuclear was our code for telling Mom. Yellow just looked at me and said, "Fine, just don't call me crazy." I nodded in agreement. I was intrigued, though I was expecting a lie from my known liar of a sister. Me and Brown saw a bunch of weird, large tents, and they were occupied. She sounded excited, yet a bit scared. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, people like to camp, right? But I will admit, the area she described didn't sound like a good place to camp. Coyotes and snakes everywhere. "So you saw some people camping. What of it?" Brown shook her head and calmly said, "Not camping tents. Big, big tents. Not a single vehicle parked nearby." I was now confused, and started to think that it was a lie. Who would go that far out near the mountains, set up huge tents, then drive away? "I thought you said there were people there?" I asked. "We saw one person walking around the camp, circling it slowly," Yellow replied. Then Brown's face went pale and annoyed before she spoke. "Yeah, then Yellow did something stupid and shouted at the camp." I quickly looked at Yellow, who looked guilty but simply laughed it off. "All I did was say, 'Hey, nice tent. No big deal.'" Brown shook her head. "Yeah, but then the guy stopped and slowly turned to where we were." She went quiet and they both started to visibly get creeped out. "And?" I asked, starting to get a creepy vibe as well. "I kid you not, Blue. This guy had no eyes or a nose. Just a big, crooked smile." Brown shuddered, and then said that this was the moment when they ran without a thought, hearing a coyote howling constantly as they ran, as if the animal was directly behind them. I told them not to go near there again, and they went about their night. Like I said, Yellow is a known liar, but Brown is not. Brown is the exact opposite of Yellow, honor student, religious, and not a bad bone in her body. She would even rat on Yellow whenever she tried lying around her. To be honest, if Brown wasn't with Yellow when this happened, I wouldn't have believed it. That night I swore I saw the same SUV drive by our house every single hour until the sun came up. After that night, things started getting weird in this town. About 3 days later, the house across from us echoed a blood-curdling scream, and it didn't sound human at all. Then there was a gunshot, and if it wasn't for the neighbors also hearing it, I would have thought I dreamt it. The thing is, multiple people heard the noises, and multiple times the police were called. No one showed. The next morning, the lady who lived in the house started moving her stuff into her van, but her boyfriend was nowhere in sight, which I thought was strange because those two were inseparable. They were the perfect college couple, plus they had just moved in. I talked to my neighbor about it while she was loading everything, and he told me that he had called the cops when he heard the gunshot, and what he told me freaked me out. Here's the conversation that he had with the 911 operator. Operator: "Police will be there in no more than 5 minutes, sir." Neighbor: "Thank you." Operator hangs up abruptly. 12 minutes pass. He sees 0 police in our area or at the house, calls again. Operator: "911, what is the emergency?" Neighbor. Yeah, I just called, gunshot and scream. I was told 5 minutes, and no one is here. The operator was silent. My neighbor said, hello? Operator. Yes, sir. I have officers pulling into your area in 2 minutes. Neighbor. Okay, I'm gonna stay on the... Hangs up again. Line. 15 minutes later and still no police. He calls again. Operator. 911, what's your emergency? Neighbor. Yeah, it's me again. Where are the officers? Someone might be in danger. Operator. Sir, calm down. What's your address? Neighbor. I have given it each time I've called, but fine. Gives address again. Operator. Sir, the police are there, and have been for 20 minutes now. Neighbor. No, I'm looking at the road and all the houses. No cops. Operator. Sir, stop prank calling. Hangs up. Now I thought that was just bizarre and unsettling thinking about our lack of police. But just as he finished with the story, a car pulls in and slowly heads to the house. It was the same SUV that I saw, and not only that, but it was a police SUV. It didn't even stop. It just slowed down by each house, and then slowly drove by the college girl loading her stuff up. She froze and stared at the cop car, and only continued when it left. I had enough, so I went over to ask if she needed any help loading things into her car, and she said yes. I started putting boxes in from the garage. I saw a poster of Sauron in one of the boxes, so we started talking about our shared love and obsession for Lord of the Rings. Then I asked where her boyfriend was, and she said, gone, without hesitation. I didn't push it. Once I had the last box in, I asked her if she had any more inside. She quickly jumped between me and the door inside and said, no, thank you, but that's all I have. I smiled and said, no worries, glad to be of help. I forced a calm, relaxed expression when I saw that her garage door leading inside was DIY locked from the outside. She got into her car and stared ahead, and all she said to me was, don't trust the police, don't trust the TV, and don't trust the animals. I felt a shiver run up my spine and quietly asked, what do you mean? She started her car and simply said, stay away from the mountain. She drove away and closed the garage as she went. I walked back to my house, and even as I write this, no one comes in or out of that house. In between then and last night, our neighborhood has been infested with coyotes, though not a single one has been seen. Strange police behavior, a strange accumulation of crows and helicopters that only ever come by at night, circling my neighborhood. But on to last night. Yellow's cat got out, and we were looking for him. We exhausted everywhere except the desert. Yellow wanted to go, but these few weeks have been creepy and stressful, and we're both small girls. So I agreed, but we were gonna go prepared. Me and Yellow went back home and got flashlights, backup batteries, 2 knives each, and my metal baseball bat. Yellow's boyfriend Green tagged along, which made me feel safer because he is tall and is the captain of the wrestling team. He brought a stun gun after we told him why we were prepared for the worst. So me, Yellow, and Brown went into the desert and searched for her cat. The entire time I couldn't stop staring at the mountain in the distance. After everything that has been going on, being in this area scared the living crap out of me. That is when we heard the meowing in the distance. It definitely sounded like Yellow's cat. The only issue is that it was coming from the direction of the creepy mountain. Yellow started to go in that direction. Green and I followed soon after. Yellow said something that I already assumed, but wished was wrong. This is towards where me and Brown saw the tents. I started thinking the worst. We're gonna get killed, or we're gonna get sold into trafficking. My thoughts were going crazy, and my anxiety shot through the roof. That's when Green looked through his binoculars and said that he saw the tent. I quickly snatched them away and looked, and sure enough, 3 big military tents, and not far behind it was the mountain. If it wasn't for the lights in the camp, I wouldn't be able to see anything in the dark. I examined as much as I could. I didn't see a man circling, though I did see what looked to be a military truck pulling in, then 4 soldier-looking people hopped into the truck, and it went toward the mountain. The 3 of us just watched in the quiet and practically jumped to Mars when we heard a meow behind us. Sure enough, Yellow's cat was right there, happy and purring. We all collectively laughed at how silly we were, and then we picked up the cat and calmly went back home. On our way, we joked at how we had just stumbled on a military post, nothing else. We got home and the cat went and stared out the back door into the dark backyard, which I thought was weird, but then again, it's a cat and they do weird stuff all the time. I woke up to my mom yelling. Apparently, someone had gotten into the fridge and eaten tonight's dinner. She said it was an animal, but my dogs were in my room with me, so she assumed that it was the cat. Yellow shrugged it off and cleaned it up, but the weirdest thing was that it did look like the cat did it, as there was clumps of raw meat in his fur and around his mouth. But it looked like a bear had gotten into our fridge, and that the cat had just continued to stare out the window, only stopping about a few hours ago and sleeping. I got curious, and decided to walk out into the desert while it was day out. Safe, right? Well, that's what I thought, and I was wrong. I went with that baseball bat and Green's binoculars and followed the exact same path, and you probably guessed it. Not a single tent or sign of anything, but there was a coyote just sitting where the tents had been. It was staring up at me with strange eyes and a crooked face. I heard it howl, but I didn't see it howl. I took a step back, and it stepped forward. Then I booked it. I didn't want to be that dumb white girl in the horror movie who lingers around and gets killed, but running seemed like a scarier option. I sprinted all the way home with the sounds of growling and howling directly in my ear. I swear I could feel the breath on the back of my neck, but I never turned around. If I was gonna die, I was gonna die looking forward. As soon as I hit gravel, the noise stopped, and for whatever reason I immediately turned around, ready to swing with my bat, and all I saw was the back of a man walking back to the mountain with his hands in his long black trench coat. From behind I could see that he was bald, and wore jet black sunglasses. His skin was pale as snow, and he wore a fedora-like hat on his head. I stared at him until he was gone, and not once did he turn around. I'm home now, more confused, more creeped out than anything else. I think I might investigate further, but I don't know. I have been fascinated by ghosts and the supernatural my entire life. I've had a few experiences here and there, but this one in particular was the most significant and frightening. First, some background. My dad's side of the family is Native American, and some have a deep suspicion of owls. They're considered evil omens. Anyways, my grandmother was very, very attuned to spirits. She had the so-called second sight. She had a whole wealth of stories about her encounters with the paranormal, who she passed on to my aunt. But anywho, this next bit is relevant. A few months before she passed away from lupus, she woke up in a panic and came running into my aunt's room. My grandmother was generally a stoic, unflappable woman, so this was not like her. She dragged my aunt into her bedroom asking if she heard it. My aunt heard nothing. What my grandmother had heard was the so-called death owl. She passed on not too long after that. Fast forward about 10 years or so, I'm up around 4 a.m. watching TV. As I recall, it was around December of 2008. I heard this noise outside. It sounded like a woman weeping. The best way I can describe it was a voice that was caught between an owl's cry and a human's. It was very unnatural. I got a cold feeling in my gut because I knew exactly what it was, and it scared the ever-loving crap out of me. I remember being paralyzed with fear. I grew up out in the country, and I know what an owl sounds like. I've also heard bobcats, foxes, and the dying screams of rabbits. This was none of those things. Others have tried to claim that it was just an animal, but it was like no other animal I've ever heard. That unearthly wailing noise, like it was in mourning. It was the kind of sound that freezes the blood in your veins. At the time, I thought it might be foretelling my father's imminent death, since if you hear it, it either means that you or a family member is going to die, or it predicts great disaster. And for clarification, at the time, my dad was having some significant heart trouble, but he's much better now. Now comes the twist. On April 9th, 2009, a huge wildfire swept through my area. A lot of houses burned down, and mine was among them. When we came back, my home was nothing but a pile of smoking rubble. It took me a bit to make the connection, but I am positive that the death owl, or banshee, was an omen that predicted this disaster. One thing's for sure, I hope to God that I never hear that thing again, because I will never forget it. I have a suspicion that this thing stalks my family. I can't be certain. I'll have to do some research into my family tree. I know this might sound unbelievable to some, but I swear till the day that I die that this is all 100% true. So there you have it, folks. My most significant paranormal encounter. On our way home from a camping trip, my family stopped by the Oak Springs Trilobite site to fossil hunt. If you don't know the southeastern Nevada desert, the attractions are low to moderately traveled, and you will often be one of the only visitors. This site in particular was empty, and we were the only people there. A quarter-mile trail leads you to a shale deposit where you can sift through for fossils. Shortly after starting out, I heard a man call out conversationally, not really shouting, but talking loudly enough to communicate with someone a distance away. I was facing west on a south-facing slope, and he sounded like he was down and to the left, closer to me than the highway. I paused and took a look around. There was no dust, or engine noises, or anything like that. No crunching of footsteps. Nothing. There were flies buzzing about, and I decided that a bug had just buzzed in my ear. A minute later, I heard another man call out, this time up the slope to my right. Probably just another bug. Sounds can get weird in rocky canyons, so it was no biggie. We came upon the site, dug around for about 30 minutes, and found a few unimpressive specimens, so we headed back for the truck. At this point, I had forgotten all about the voices. Driving away, I asked Hubs, "What did you think? Pretty cool?" I'm the rock hound, and never know if he's enjoying my hobby as much as I am. He replied, "Sure, yeah, it was actually pretty cool." Pause. But I kept hearing these voices, and I couldn't tell where they were coming from. He had a face shield up over his ears at the time, making it unlikely that a bug could have possibly buzzed in there. He said that he was hearing them on the way back to the truck, and heard them calling out at least 3 times. Caliente is nearby, and Pioche a ways further, and both towns have histories dating back to ye olde mining days and Mormon frontiering. There are lots of railroad, gunfight, and native raid stories, and some weird Warren Jeffs type stuff. Not to mention Area 51 being sorta/relatively nearby. Now, we are both atheists and skeptics. We don't believe in ghost stories, and neither of us have ever had a paranormal experience. But this one has us scratching our heads. I was raised to understand and live in harmony with the paranormal. There were a lot of spirits and odd happenings surrounding me when I was younger. I've never really liked being alone in the dark, but I don't remember being afraid of anything supernatural until one night. I was about 13, and we had recently moved into my aunt's old house. I immediately disliked the house, and especially my room. They just felt wrong. Still, we set everything up. We put my 4-poster bed against the wall in such a way that my headboard was in a corner, and my footboard sat right against the light switch. So if I laid on my bed and looked down, I saw the light switch, doorway, and top of the footboard. I had a big window to my right, with a street light just outside it. My bedroom door wouldn't close and the hallway light stayed on. Anyway, I started to see shadowy figures during the day and night, but that was pretty normal. I woke up a few nights to tiny footsteps and cackling. I assumed they were goblins being annoying. I always felt watched. The first night something seemed wrong, I woke up hanging halfway off of my bed. I couldn't see any light or figure out how I was even laying. Finally, I found my footboard. I reached out much further than the switch should have been and turned on the bedroom light. As soon as I touched the switch, I could see the street and hallway lights again. About 2 nights later, I woke up just in time to see a dark figure appear over my footboard. It looked like a man's head and shoulders with thick black material draped over it. There were no facial features, and the blackness continued like it had a body, but no arms or anything. When I think back, it reminds me of the Dementors from Harry Potter, but it slithered up over my footboard. I could feel the weight, and I could move, but it seemed like a bad idea. So I closed my eyes. I felt the weight continue up to my chest, pause, and disappear. I opened my eyes, and it was gone. I felt strangely better in the house after that, and I haven't seen it since. It was still one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had. I don't know what it was, or who it was looking for. This is a true story. When I was in high school, I had a friend who lived near our house. We would always walk from school to our homes. We were pretty close, and we talked about anything. One time, when we were walking along the road, she suddenly spoke and said that she smelled candles. It was a busy street, and it was only around 4 p.m., I think. I replied, "It must be from the truck." I said this because one had just driven past us when she said that. She had a serious face, which was unusual because she was more talkative between the two of us. She insisted that she could still smell it as we continued walking, but stopped after a while. Fast forward to the next day. It was Saturday and I had just woken up. I literally got goosebumps. I felt so shocked when I read her text. It said that her father had died. Do you also believe in superstitions? Here in our country, a smell of flower or candle indicates the death of a person. A while back, I was chosen to be in an indie film about djinns, basically the local versions of demons. Before I continue, there are 4 things you should know about them. 1. It is said that they can take the form of animals and humans with circle eyes, literally circles for eyes. 2. They are supposedly born from smokeless fire. 3. They feed on energy, such as the energy you use to stay awake and the energy used to power electronics. And 4, an extra one. There are Christian djinns, Muslim djinns, you name it. They have their own free will, so everyone is different. Some are very nice, others not so much. So now for the tale. We were filming in the desert and a series of events started to occur. Right when we arrived, there was instantly a presence of something there. Then a knife, bent, twisted, with red marks, started appearing at my feet every 15 meters or so. Constantly, for the entire time that I was in the desert, this knife would follow me. 4 nights or so into filming, right as we were packing up, a loud screech could be heard. It was sort of a mix between a falcon, a wolf, and a mountain lion. It was later revealed to us by an expert of desert animals that there were no animals in the desert that made that sort of sound. On the 5th night, things began to get interesting. At one point we were sitting down taking a break when the sand just started to smoke. We thought that maybe a small plant had combusted because of the heat. After a minute or 2, the smoke stopped. We checked and there was no plant. We sat back down, and the second our butts hit the seat, boom, the sand all around the smoking area and where the smoke had been burst into flames, with 0 reasons to. Then, after that, all of our cameras started to lose their batteries very, very quickly. This was frightening because 1, it meant that we had to stay there longer, and 2, as mentioned in number 3 at the top, they feed on energy. The next night, albino scorpions, which are extremely rare, started sprinting toward the actors, literally going at full speed. We were forced to kill these rare creatures by burning them with a torch, and every time one died, 2 would replace it. Literally, 2 more would come out of nowhere, full speed ahead. This continued for several minutes. Things like this kept happening for the entire 2 weeks or so that we were at the site. When we finished filming, we split up for a bit to let the director edit some stuff. Then we had to film parts at a house. It is important here to mention that the movie was called 3 a.m. We were talking and one of the actors stated that since we had to split up, he had woken up at 3 a.m. every morning, his dogs going crazy, his alarm clock going off, and his AC setting itself to 3 degrees Celsius. 2 of the other actors revealed that the same thing had been happening to them. At the same time, I had never felt alone while I was in my room at night. Something was watching us. It followed us home. Since then, we have finished the film. I've started praying for protection every night based on the events that have happened. The actor who originally had the alarm go off at 3 a.m. moved to another house. Another actor moved to Canada. We were filming in UAE, which is in the Middle East, so this was pretty far away. A second actor also moved internationally, and I am moving in 4 weeks or so. I'm just hoping that it doesn't follow me home again. My grandparents died about 10 years ago. They both died peacefully of old age and left an old house in a countryside. That house has a lot of great memories. My best Christmas and birthdays. Despite that, recently I've started having nightmares that would always have the house in them. Sometimes someone's chasing me, other times there are ghosts. It's always basically a horror movie scenario. Being religious, I thought it was about time to visit my grandparents' graves and light a candle. It's about a 3-hour drive, so I decided to visit them and crash at their house for the night. Well, I'm never doing that again. It was still bright outside when I arrived. I went inside to open the windows and clean up a bit. That's when I heard a weird sound. It was as if someone was walking in the room, but no one was there except me. I was spooked, but I convinced myself that there must be rats or other creatures in the attic. I managed to stay calm and rational, and spent the rest of the evening watching YouTube in bed. That's when the fun started. The internet connection is terrible there. You kinda have to walk around the room to catch 4G like some sort of Wi-Fi. Like many times before, my internet lagged and I ended up sitting in silence. This is when I heard it, loud and clear. There was someone in the kitchen, and they turned on the light switch. I was sure it was that switch, because whenever you turn on the light in the kitchen, it made this loud click sound. I literally froze. I was in the middle of nowhere, and I was about to be killed by some maniac. All the knives were in the kitchen too, and I only had pepper spray in my bag. Then the intruder started walking, slow steps as if they were just wandering around. I thought I will die from fear, and I didn't know for how long that I was frozen, but it really did feel like forever. I was literally waiting to be killed. I don't know how much more time passed, but it was long enough that my muscles started spasming from being so intense and not moving. I gathered all courage, hoping that the intruder had left, and somehow managed to go to the kitchen. The light was on as expected, but the person had already left. I ran to the door, expecting to see it wide open, but to my surprise, it was shut down and locked, as I had left it. There was no sign of entry. I'm never going back alone. I was in the Marine Corps from 2008 to 2012. I served as an infantry Marine and was stationed in 29 Palms, California. In 2009, while training for my first deployment, we went to a specialty school called Marine Corps Cold Weather Mountain Warfare School, which was located in Bridgeport, California. I enjoyed the 5-ish hour bus ride up Highway 395 through the Sierra Nevada mountains. I took in the beautiful scenery as my mind wondered about what I was in for, dreading climbing the 12,000-foot mountains that littered the landscape. Weeks of training go by. I was relieved to hear that we were moving to a place called Hawthorne to do some live fire exercises. It was about 30 miles away to the east back into the desert, an old out-of-commission army base that was deemed uninhabitable in the 50s for various reasons. I was enthusiastic to escape the bitterly cold temps up on the mountain. Slept on the ride there. Upon waking, I looked out the window and was shocked at what I saw. Remnants of the old base scattered the landscape. Halfway destroyed buildings, guard towers, and other typical military stuff that you'd expect to see. Behind that lied jagged lava rock mountains casting their shadows over the destroyed buildings. The place looked like a nuclear bomb had gone off nearby. Have you ever seen the old nuclear test videos from when it was first developed? They would stage a fake town to analyze what the blast would do. This place was like that, mixed with that game series Fallout and Chernobyl, if you've ever heard of that. As we drove in further, I noticed a bunch of mine shafts heading into the sides of the mountains. Now, I was very curious as to where we would be staying at. I was relieved to hear that there was a makeshift FOB. Nothing fancy by any means, just an old green tent for the NCOs and upper-ranking battalion staff. Us boots would be sleeping under the stars in the dirt. At least we had a makeshift HESCO wall around us to make things feel like home. During chow that evening, we were all sitting around talking. I asked my sergeant, what are all the mine shafts in the hillside for? He said they were munitions storage facilities as well as fallout shelter. The place was designed during the Cold War era, which made it super creepy. It's like all the people just decided one day to leave. Vehicles were still there, everything. It was strange. Night arrives. It was fairly hot out even though it was night as we were back down in the desert. I was having problems sleeping, even though I was just in my skivvies on top of my sleeping bag. Some of the others were awake talking, I could hear. I stared into the stars and mountains looming over me. It was a full moon that night with hardly any clouds. As I was scanning the mountaintops, which, if I had to guess, were around 500 to 700 feet above me, where we were all sleeping made it seem that I could almost reach out and touch the top. I saw something strange moving about at the peak. Figuring my eyes were playing tricks on me from extreme physical exhaustion and sleep deprivation, I disregarded it. Even later that night, I awoke to go take a pee. As I'm utilizing the head, I look up to where I saw something earlier. To my surprise, the strange, silhouetted figures were there, scurrying about the ridgeline. Now this has definitely caught my interest as my mind was wandering. Thankfully, I had a lot of cool stuff lying in my pack. Once at my gear, I grabbed my trusty PVS-14 night vision monocular. I bring them to my eye and look back up. Nothing? That can't be right. Like, huh? I swear I saw something. I look over to a buddy of mine that was awake and asked, "Hey, did you see anything up there?" He looks at me and says, "What are you talking about, bro?" I said, "Forget it." A few more hours go by through the night, and a loud crash comes from the closest mine shaft, which was located 100 feet or so from the FOB. Literally half the platoon sat straight up from a dead sleep. One of the sergeants screams from nearby and says it hit the rack. It was just some rocks falling, which made sense to most of us. The next morning, we woke up and did what we had planned to do for that day. Later that afternoon, we had some free time, and were creeping around checking the nearby buildings out. 4 of us decided to go down into a building. It was half above ground and half below. The wide staircase went down to open up into a larger cubicle-type area. Barely any light came through the small windows. I clicked on my weapon light and scanned the room. There were still papers and everything strewn about on top of the desks. We followed the hallway, which made a right turn. MOPP suits and gas masks lined the hallway, hanging on hooks. We see a sign above one of the doorways that said, "Girls' Locker Room." Us being the typical 19-year-old Marines that we were, we decided that we had to check that out. I took point and entered the pitch-black room. I was looking through the lockers to try and find something interesting when all of a sudden, the door behind us slams shut. We all ran like hell out the other door on the other side. This story comes from my girlfriend, who told me that a couple of months ago her mom was exiting an office that she works at in the middle of the night when she saw an apparition. She described it as looking like a very abnormally large black dog that was staring her down in the parking lot. Apparently the dog charged at her and vanished as it went through her, never to be seen again after that. Now, my girlfriend's mom is no stranger to the paranormal, and has tons of crazy stories, and this being the latest incident, she knew it meant something bad. She called my girlfriend frantically, asking her to check on her grandpa, who they were taking care of for about a year at that point, but he was okay. 2 days later, however, he passed on. This also happened to my girlfriend's grandma on her mom's side, where she was outside and saw a large, black dog on the roof of her house staring her down until it jumped down and vanished into her as well. Her first husband died after she received this visit from the dog. From what I could take from the story, it seemed more immediate than just 2 days. It was the first I've ever heard of a large black dog figure appearing, and a few hours later my curiosity led me to searching for similar experiences online. I stumbled across mythology and folklore, speaking of how large black dogs and or hellhounds are omens of death. Earlier today, I think I might have seen something, but I don't know. This happened a few hours ago while I was outside mowing my lawn. Quick layout of my yard. When you walk down my driveway toward the street, if you look to the left, you'll see a dead end, and if you look to the right, you'll see a big tree that you couldn't see through. This is relevant. Now, on to what happened. I was mowing the lawn inside my fence, and when I finished that, I went over to the part of my yard that was outside of my fence. After I finished mowing, I looked to the right and saw a pair of legs on the other side of the tree. All I saw was legs, because I couldn't see the person through the trees. But their legs were all black. Like I couldn't make out any features. I couldn't see any pants or shoes. It was just all pitch black. I'm confused, and so I try walking around the tree to see who it was, but whatever it was ran away. It only took me 2 seconds to get to the other side, but as I said, whatever it was gone. I live on the corner of my block, so there's nowhere that a person could have hidden that fast. I've never believed in the paranormal or had any sort of experience, but I really can't explain what happened. Anyone who's had a similar experience and could possibly give me an explanation, I would appreciate it, because I'm still confused. Lately, I've been dreaming about pretty weird stuff. I can't remember everything, of course, but I'm going to try to explain it to the best of my ability. About 1 week ago, I started dreaming more often and I could remember them clearly when I woke up, but after about 2 days, some inconsistencies popped up. At the end of the dream, I would start hearing weird noises. This, of course, didn't bother me until 2 days ago when I woke up very early, about 6 in the morning, and the sound was still there. I jumped out of bed and turned on the lights and noticed that my window cover, a sliding cover since my roof is slanted, was pretty much wide open. My window is right under a streetlight, so I always close it because I need complete darkness to sleep. When I jumped up and turned on the lights in my room, the sound immediately stopped. It's hard to explain the noise, but it sounded like the flapping of a piece of clothing against the window. I'm pretty sure that it shouldn't have happened because that's my only window, and there is never any draft in my room. I decided to just go downstairs and forget about it since I was probably still just half asleep. This is where it got weird. I have a little decorative Captain America shield on the desk in my room, which is next to the door. This is important. I started dreaming normally, superpowers and stuff, until I somehow made it back to my home in my dream, and in my dream I sat down behind my desk with the door open. When I look out of the door from my desk, I see the closet doors from across the hall. In my dream, I remember that I started to fall asleep behind my desk, and I could see out of the corner of my eye that the closet door started to open. When I looked up and blinked, it was all normal again. This happened once more. But the third time I looked up, and the closet door kept opening. So I got scared and threw the Captain America shield at the closet door. In my dream, not in real life as far as I know. And then I jumped out of my bed, scared. When I turned the lights on at, again, 6 in the morning, the shield was gone, and lying on the floor next to me. I was very sure that that shield had been on my desk when I went to sleep. I was reading somebody's Reddit post today where they talked about their mother being scared because she heard 3 knocks and related it to the 3-knock omen, which I had never heard of. I decided to do some research on it, and apparently there's a superstition around hearing 3 knocks because it's supposedly followed by a death in the family or someone that's close to you. That has happened to me. A couple years ago, I went to a mountain resort in California for a little over a month and stayed with my sister and brother-in-law who lived there. Around the same time when I came, they got a new roommate. He was a nice guy, maybe in his late 20s, early 30s, an ex-alcoholic, but overall, just a really great guy. I spent a lot of my summer going on hikes and playing video games with him and my brother-in-law, and I would say that I got to know him pretty well, but not as well as my sister and her husband did. The roommate, Jack, had lost a close friend a year or so before when he got drunk and decided to fall asleep outside in the middle of a snowstorm, which apparently happens more often than you would think. Since then, Jack had never so much as touched a beer, and he was quite proud of it. Anyways, it was around my 3rd or 4th week there, when my sister and I were watching The Babadook, and it was pretty late at night, around 1, maybe 2 a.m. The movie ended, and she was going to let me sleep in the room with her since Jack and her husband were out camping or something, but I don't really remember what they were doing. It was silent in the house, and all the lights were off when we heard 3 loud, distinct knocking sounds. I asked her if she had heard them, and she said yes, but it was probably just the dryer making noises upstairs. It was a fairly new dryer that didn't make any sound. Maybe around 10 minutes later we heard the same 3 knocks again, but my sister wrote it off to the dryer being noisy once more. It didn't sound like a broken dryer, since it was 3 obvious knocks, though. I don't want to go too far into the history of the house or anything, but it was definitely haunted. Things would randomly fly off of shelves, and the lights would randomly turn themselves off. Also, some of the furniture that the house came with had what we thought were blood stains. I wrote that night off to the spirit in their house messing with us since we were watching a scary movie, up until today, when I put everything together. 2 days after I left, they found Jack dead in his room upstairs. They said he drank himself to death, which was surprising considering how proud he was of getting sober. Maybe the death knocks were real, or maybe not. Maybe it was all just a coincidence. What do you think? Also, I should probably also mention that he had a bad liver from his previous drinking problem. I don't really know how that works, but I guess one night of extremely heavy drinking did it for him. I didn't push for more information about his death since it really shook my sister up. All she said was that he drank himself to death. Disclaimer. In no way am I saying that death knocks are 100% real, or that if you hear them, a family member or friend will definitely drop dead. As for the furniture that we thought had blood on it, it might not have been blood. Maybe it was just an odd-colored stain from where something had been spilled. I'm not saying that I'm sure that Jack's death was related to anything that happened in the house. I just made the connection and found it fascinating. The desert is a scary place for me now. It used to be a place filled with peace and serenity, but since living out there for almost 30 years, you see things. This occurrence took place in the high desert of California in the early 1990s. The whole town was once all military. There's a military plant there and a prison, and the streets to this day consist of numbers and letters, for example, Avenue O and 178th Street. You always heard stories of people missing and underground tunnels confirmed. In fact, a friend of mine kept getting a draft coming from his closet in his childhood home. Later, after he grew up, he checked it out and found an opening to one of these such tunnels. He called me over to check it out, but after I got there and we went through the opening, I was too freaked out to go more than 10 feet in when I turned around and told him that this might be how people disappear. You always saw things late at night, off in the distance far past the lights of that then small town. Strange, glowing, different colored lights that would move around low or zigzag, then shoot straight up. We saw things in the sky, just stuff you never talked about. Life was pretty carefree back then. If you wanted to visit friends, though, you would have to drive down long desert roads and sometimes end up coming home late at night in the pitch black because there were no street lights. I recall coming home late one such night with my boyfriend at the time and another friend, and we pulled over for some reason. Something compelled me to get out of the car and look up at the stars. We were in the middle of nowhere, but we could hear what sounded like machinery and muffled clanks like metal. We all started looking around but didn't see anything. Just then, we felt a vibration under our feet. I crouched down on the street to put my ear to the ground. It was coming from under us. We all listened intently and heard far down voices, but couldn't make out what was being said. We stood up and were discussing what it might have been when we saw a small red light on the horizon and it was getting closer. We piled into the car and got out of Dodge. We only told a few friends, and they said that they had experienced the same thing. A year later, I told a friend that I started a small hauling business. Still, there was a big job, so I needed to borrow a trailer. He said he had a few that I could use, so I should come out to his property to check them out. It was just starting to get dark when he pulled out his new toy. It was a pair of military-grade night vision binoculars. He told me to wait until it got dark to leave, because he wanted to show me something creepy, and I was all in. Later we walked towards the back of his property, looking out at nothing, no lights, no roads, nothing but a barren desert. He pointed the binoculars east, and oh my. There were people coming out of the ground and moving around. I said, "What the hell am I looking at?" And he told me that his family called them ground dwellers, and that they are located in various parts of the desert. It gave me the heebie-jeebies. Needless to say, I never went to his house after dark again. At one point in my life, I lived in a mobile home park a little past Avenue F. There was a massive treehouse in my yard that was left by a former tenant. The only way to get up into it was through a hole cut in the floor with a door on it, and under that was a rope ladder. One night I was sitting on the porch drinking a cup of tea when I heard something move up in the treehouse, and then a head popped up. It was a lady and her husband hiding. Clearly, I thought they were on drugs. I told them to come down from there, but they both refused. It wasn't until I threatened to call the authorities did they cautiously comply, looking all around, not wanting to be seen. By now, there's a small group of my friends and nosy neighbors gathering around. I saw that she was terrified by something, so I asked them to come in. I made them something to eat and waited for her to calm down. Then the lady reached in her bag and pulled out some papers. They looked like legal documents with government letterhead. There were drawings and schematics, and some of them even had embossed seals. I couldn't help but notice that they had water and smoke damage, and a few of them were burnt on the edges. She told me that they were checking out this place off of Beryl Springs Road, where there were 2 or 3 cinder block structures. I knew them well. A few years back I happened upon that place, and a black truck rushed down to greet me with guns drawn. She said the same thing happened to her, but she was in one of the structures, so she grabbed some things, and she and her husband ran. I went over these pages, and felt very uneasy reading them, like this was stuff that people get killed over if it got out. Stupidly, I said, "Why don't you just simply give them back?" She said that they had been running, and everywhere they stopped, a black car or van with government or no plates showed up with darkened windows and would just sit there watching them. Well, I really didn't want to get too involved, especially after reading what I did think was way too big for a little ol' me. I will take what I saw to my death. So I packed them lunch and told them that they could sleep in the treehouse for the night. They did, but they were gone early the next morning before I woke up. After that, we started seeing black vans parked on our lonely road facing the house. At one point, I even walked up to them, but they took off as soon as I knocked on their blacked-out driver's door window. Lots of unexplained things happened out there in the desert that you don't see much of now. I think because there are more lights and people, well-lit towns, and camera phones pointing everywhere. There weren't cell phones to call for help back then. I remember one time a few years later, it was a fun day with some of my friends. We were in this stupid little red car called a Yugo that seemed to be on its last leg most of the time. My friend's uncle told him that there was a whole abandoned town far west of the Mojave Desert, and that there were things just left there all over the place. We were so dumb. It took us a long time to get out there, and if you asked me to try and find out how now, I don't know if I could. I wasn't driving. Thinking we were lost a few times, we started seeing things. A carnival ticket booth on a trailer, broken tractors and furniture, little shacks here and there, and empty water bottles all over the place. There wasn't a livable house or store or place of business for many, many miles. I wondered how anyone could even survive in a place like this, and then we saw it. It was a long and looked like single-wide mobile home, if you could ever call it home. It was between 60 to 50 feet long, and it was raised with the siding going all the way to the ground. It looked like something from a horror movie. It had several windows down the length of the house. Some of the windows had old frayed curtains still hung up and blowing in the desert breeze. There were open sections of missing siding, exposing the darkness underneath the structure big enough to step or crawl through. There were old, dusty cars with their doors and trunks open, trash and open cans all over, and a small fire pit in the middle of all of this. His girlfriend and I saw people that seemed to not be wearing any clothes that we could make out, but their bodies were skinny and didn't move like ours. They were inside that house and were watching us from the windows and from the open spaces underneath. They were following us, and as we slowly drove past, they went from window to window and open space to open space underneath. They were almost inhuman, and had big eyes and pale skin. Too pale for the desert. My friend the driver pulled up next to the fire pit, and despite us screaming to go, 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 he turned off the car. His girlfriend began to cry out that we had to leave then and now. He didn't see what we saw. He said, "Stop, babe, this stuff is so cool." Oh my god, I wanted to punch him in the face. We both kept looking at the people watching us while begging him to get back in the car and drive. He picked up a long bone off the ground and started to push the soot around the fire pit and said, "Hey, it looks like somebody cooked a dog." Just then he looked up. His girlfriend leaned over to the driver's seat and grabbed his jacket in an attempt to pull him back into the car when he finally saw what we were seeing and said, "Oh shit." That thing hiding under the house was swaying back and forth. His hands were on both sides of the opening, and he was staring at us almost with the intent to lunge. He tried to start the car, but it failed. Thinking that this was my end, that I was about to be eaten in the desert, I began to beat on the back of his seat, screaming, "Please, God, start." After 3 tries, it finally did. We tore out of there, leaving a huge cloud of dust. We pulled over far from that location and tried to compose ourselves. Never again. We didn't talk about what we saw after that. I think that we were in disbelief that it had even happened. There were so many crazy things that occurred in the desert back in those days. Too many to even come close to tell you. I know that there are things that we do not, or maybe will never, understand. I also know that there are more eyes now paying attention, so I don't think it will be too much longer before we all know the truth. When I was around 12, maybe 13 years old, I'm 24 now, I was staying at my dad's house for the weekend. We watched movies and ate junk food, a usual occurrence when I got to see him. My brother was also usually with us, but this time he was staying with a friend that night. I decided it was time for bed around 11 that evening. I went for my routine, getting ready for bed. He decided that it was time for bed around 11 that evening, and I went about my usual routine, getting ready for sleep. I lay down and tried to pass out. I was restless this night for some reason, just feeling completely uneasy. My bed used to be vertical to the door with my feet closest to the door. I always used to sleep with my door open. I guess it gave me some comfort being able to see half of the entrance to my dad's door, knowing that he wasn't far away. Anyway, as I said, I just couldn't get to sleep, and frustrated, I laid there staring at my ceiling for a moment, and then felt as if someone were watching me. I shifted my eyes to the doorway, and a pitch-black figure was standing there, its head almost touching the top of the frame. I've never had an issue with sleep paralysis, and never have had it since, but then, in that moment, I could not move. All I could do was look at this tall figure that stood there, staring at me. Tears began to flow down my cheeks, and my heart felt as if it were going to beat out of my chest. I managed to barely whisper, "Dad?" And it turned its head sideways at me as if it were confused. I began hyperventilating intensely, which must have woken my dad because he came running into my room, and as he came through the door, the figure dissolved, as if a breeze came by, and it went away with it. My dad held me as I cried. I slept in his room that night, and for the rest of my stay there until I went back to my mom's. This event shook me to my core, and to this day, I cannot and will not sleep with an open door. I still have a deep feeling of fear, and almost want to cry when I picture that thing, and remember that night. I do believe in the paranormal. Not routinely and not as an explanation for everything, but I definitely believe that some things just can't be logically explained. I've dabbled in divination for the past couple years, which has led me to notice more universal symbolism and omens. Recently, I've seen some weird ones. I was driving around my area the other day and passed a funeral procession twice. It struck me as sort of unsettling and out of the ordinary. I drive around a lot, and I don't usually see funeral processions around just randomly. I was a little bit anxious by it, especially so when I passed the hearse itself, but I pretty much brushed it off. That same day, I was pulling into a drive-thru at around 3 a.m., and a black cat came out of seemingly nowhere. It strolled in front of the car and continued walking into nothing. It felt very rare to see, since I live in a well-populated suburb that doesn't usually have animals roaming about. This morning, there was a black cat watching my window on the windowsill of the house across from mine. As I looked at the cat, it began to thunderstorm. I know it all sounds really small and maybe a touch overzealous, but I couldn't help but feeling odd about these things because of how out of the ordinary that they felt, and silently spooky. Not to mention, all happening in the same couple of days. The closeness of it all made me curious, and I had to look into it, just to see if these things were things that other people believed to be bad omens. In my very unofficial research, I have found that 1. Passing a funeral can be bad luck and can, quote-unquote, hasten your own death. 2. In European folklore, a black cat crossing your path can be unlucky and lead to misfortune and death. Occasionally, however, they can represent good luck, but from what I've found, it's fairly situational. And 3, in Greek mythology, thunder could represent punishment to the humans by the gods, associated with Zeus. Clearly, death is kind of a theme here. All of this just doesn't sit well with me, and it's accompanied by a generally strange feeling that I've noticed prevailing in my mood lately. Something just feels off, you know? I don't think this was paranormal, but it felt so real that it undid many of the knots in my heart. My father passed away 21 years ago, when I was 20 years old, leaving behind his mother, my grandmother, wife, my mom, and a daughter, me. 2 years before his death, my father had urged my grandmother to sell her small home and shift with us so that we could look after her in her old age. He built a decent house, considering he came from a very poor background, that we had to sell off after he passed away. My grandmother passed away 2 years ago. I often used to think about how our life would have been had he been still alive. He was an honest man, but in a powerful position. When he passed away, I was still in college and unmarried, with no exposure to the outside world. Had he been alive for a few more years, I could have used his guidance to fulfill my career plans. He was the only earning member of the family. After he passed away, nothing remained the same. We all struggled financially, emotionally, and ultimately physically. Then I got married to a verbally, financially abusive man. But I saw this dream only yesterday, never before it. I had not been thinking about him or of any of my difficulties before I went to bed. In the dream, I was in my grandmother's house, which again we had sold 23 years ago. She had passed away, but my father was alive. He was sadly looking at the empty house from his childhood. I asked him what he planned to do with the house. He said he would probably sell it, but he sounded very sad as he said it. Then I suggested if we should keep the house and just rent it out. This way, we could return to it whenever we want and have a financial backup too. My father said that in the face of financial difficulty, we have a bigger home to fall back on. But he seemed relieved that he didn't have to sell his childhood home. When I woke up, I realized that it had all felt so real, as if I had lived an alternate life. It was what life could have been. I cried, but I also felt that I had been lucky to be able to live in that life. Does anyone believe in alternate lives here? Do you think my soul had made a trip to an alternative life somehow? There are many stories from border crossers. Many people see ghosts and other things. I knew this one lady. She was a friend of my parents. She crossed to the desert to get to the U.S. She was with a group of people and the coyote led them. It was nighttime and the people rested. The coyote said to keep going because they'd lost a lot of time, so they got up and continued walking. Well, they came in front of this bushy-like place, and when you crossed, the tips of the branches caught your clothes. It was dark and hard to see, but they were in a line and followed each other. The lady I know was tired from walking just like everyone else was, but she said there was this old man next to her who complained about how he was in pain and just too tired to continue. Soon they passed by this trench. It was so dark that you couldn't see how far down it was before it stopped. They walked next to the trench, and the old lady told me that the bushes kept scratching her face and getting at her clothing. The lady then said that she turned around to look at the old man next to her and saw that he had tripped and fallen down in the trench, but he didn't make any noise. The lady got scared and panicked. She told her husband, and the husband told the coyote to stop, that a man fell in the ditch. The coyote had a flashlight and he shined it down into the trench, and it wasn't that deep. He went down with the flashlight, but he didn't see any man. The lady told her husband that she knew he was there. She said that he fell right in front of her. The coyote was getting impatient. He looked everywhere, but still couldn't see anyone. He never found the man, and obviously he couldn't have made it very far in such a short amount of time. I guess he thought that she was lying or something, and decided to keep on moving. Soon they crossed the desert safely and all. The lady said that she thought it was weird how he fell. She said that it was a trip, but it was like he was sinking in his fall. She asked the others if they had seen him fall, and they all said no. The lady never saw that old man in the group after that. I don't really like this story because it makes me think of what might have taken him. I also heard that there are giant bugs in the desert or something like that. My family visited her house. When she told us this story, I was super scared and kept thinking about it at night. There are many people crossing the desert that have seen dead people walking around and see weird things following them at night. Last night I was turning off all of the lights and getting ready for bed. I just had my flashlight from my phone to do some tidying up in the kitchen. I turn it off and go walk into the bedroom. Across from the kitchen, in the living room, there is a shadow. This was something that was different from the usual, as it clearly caught my attention. It was something that looked like a long shape peering in from the upper right side of the window, as if it was a long neck or just some weird shape, definitely abnormal. I was genuinely afraid, and kept turning the lights on and off to see when I could see it. It was only when it was completely black inside, and the street light and neighbor's porch lights were slightly illuminating the window. I tried to look out, but could only see myself in the blinds, and it really freaked me out. So I left the lamp by the window on, and after debating, I told myself not to wake my partner up because realistically it's nothing, and what could it be? I mean, we're on the second floor. It seemed really close to the window, and it wasn't moving. I'm not one to believe in paranormal activities. In fact, every time I watch scary YouTube videos that claim to be true and have paranormal shadows or movements, I instantly think it's not true and get annoyed. Walking tonight with my partner, I remembered the situation from last night. I saw nothing on the outside that would show through the window and create the shape that I saw. I quickly went inside with him to see what I could see from the inside with all the lights out again. I was expecting to see it there, and that it was something that I just never noticed before. But it was gone. The window looks completely normal, and the lights outside are the same as they always are. I'll never know what it was, and next time I will definitely be waking up my partner if I see it. I have these dreams sometimes. Sometimes they're warnings, and other times they're just odd. I started noticing that they weren't normal when I was about 8, and I started having the same dream every night. My parents were freshly divorced, and my mom had moved into this yellow house. The heater didn't work, and every window was broken. She wouldn't allow us near the windows because she was afraid we'd get cut. This house was mostly normal during the day. The buzz of the fan above the stove while Mom cooks, me and my sister playing, the TV on, just seemed normal. But every night, that dream would come back. It wasn't a bad dream, just one that I really don't get. A native man, who looked like he was probably a chief based on the headdress, would walk into the house through the front door. He would look at me for a long time before opening every cabinet and drawer, and then would exit through the back door. I had this dream for a week or two before telling my mom. But I went to her one day and I said, every night I have a dream that someone opens all the drawers, cabinets, and doors, and it's really starting to creep me out. She looked at me and told me that she had woke up and had to shut every door and cabinet and drawer that morning. Then, when I was about 10, my uncle was hospitalized. All of our family was staying together in one house so that we could all help each other out. Our uncle was a big part of our lives and really kept the family together. The adults went to visit him, and all us kids stayed home with one adult who stayed behind. When they came back, they told us very little about my uncle's condition. They just said he can't wait to be back home. That night, I dreamt that I went alone to find out what had really happened. I walked into the hospital room where my uncle was and I said, "Hey uncle, it's me, your niece. How are you?" And he said, "Who are you? I don't have any family. I don't remember them." I spent the rest of the dream trying to convince him that I was real. It smelled like hand sanitizer and old people. I woke up crying and screaming. I don't know why, but I knew it wasn't just a dream. So I asked my mom and aunt, "Why did you lie to me? Uncle doesn't even remember us." They asked me how I knew. I dreamt another time that my mom was wearing all red. She was so confident and pretty, and I remember telling her in the dream that she looked really nice. And then her boyfriend came out. He started fighting with her, asking why she was wearing that slutty color. "Are you cheating on me? You know I'll kill you if you do, right? Now you know what? I don't want to be with a woman that dresses like that. Have fun being single." I woke back up, and she was wearing all red. I begged her to change. I said, "Mom, something bad is going to happen," because I remembered how much she loved him, even if I hated him. She didn't listen, and a few minutes later I was hearing, "Are you cheating on me? You know I'll kill you if you do, right?" All over again. Things like this stopped for a while. Everything was peaceful, and I didn't read into dreams too much. Until last year, anyway. Last year I had a strange dream that my current boyfriend was in. At the time of this dream, we were only acquaintances. We had just barely met. The dream was unlike any of the others, because I wasn't all the way asleep while I was having it, and I found that I could not move. Other things happened too, but I'll get into that later. The dream starts with me walking to the bathroom because I had to pee. Then I make the decision to leave the bathroom door open because no one is home. I have the quick thought to myself, "Don't leave that door open," but I ignore it. It's gotten to the point where it's time for me to clean up and wash my hands. But when I look out the door as I'm about to get up, I see my current boyfriend. His head is tilted to the side, and he's saying, "She's here." He says it very creepily and matter-of-fact-like, but it doesn't sound like him at all. He continues and repeats himself. I say, "Who? Who is here?" But when I engage in the conversation he's trying to have, what he says changes. He starts saying, "Her heart is here." At that point, across the hall from the bathroom, my bedroom door swings open to show me a little girl. But she's not a little girl at all. She took my voice. I tried calling out for everyone. My dad, my sister, the neighbors. Nothing would come out until I called for my mother. But calling for my mother was useless. She lived an hour and a half away. I woke up calling for her. I figured it was a sign to visit, but we weren't on the best terms. Anyway, around the time Halloween was supposed to be celebrated, my cats started acting really weird in my room. I started feeling uncomfortable staying in there. I couldn't breathe in there after that dream. My cats would scratch at the walls, and sometimes would hiss at my closet for no reason. On Halloween night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the dreams I was gonna have, so I took NyQuil and passed out in a record 17 minutes. I figured I'd be asleep all through the night, but I woke up at 3 a.m. I saw someone standing next to my closet. It looked like my mom, but I wasn't sure. I shut my eyes and refused to open them because I was terrified. When I woke up, without telling my mom anything about what had happened, I asked her what she had dreamt of. And she told me, "I dreamt I was standing next to your closet." Something's not right about that closet. Maybe you should come visit for a while and give yourself some space from there. I want to make it very clear, I never told her anything about this closet. I didn't tell her that I saw her when she dreamt she was there. I didn't tell her about the girl. I didn't tell her about the cats. So I came to visit after about a month, around Thanksgiving. I had been sleeping in Dad's living room or going to friends to avoid my bedroom. I couldn't wait to sleep in a bed. Everything at Mom's was wonderful. We had movie night, talked about things, and just got caught up. So when I came back to Dad's, I actually hadn't slept. I was so happy to be at Mom's, I had just stayed up the whole time. So when I got back, I was pretty exhausted. I went to my room because I was feeling better about it. I turned on my nightlight, still terrified of the dark, and opened my bedroom door. I will die in a fire before I shut that door when I'm inside the room, and laid down to go to sleep. Instantly, the dream took me, before I was even all the way gone. I felt someone hug me and start to kiss my neck. It felt like someone I knew, and I wasn't bothered by it. But the second I relaxed into the hug, it got tighter and tighter until I couldn't breathe. I realized my nightlight wasn't on anymore, and the faint glow from the hallway wasn't much. But it was enough for me to see the closet door open and these odd creatures come out. Short, undefined. Any lines that defined them were just white lines on their shadowy bodies. I felt that they were going to hurt me, and again I was terrified, but I just woke up, and then it was over. I looked over though, and I realized that my closet door was still open, and my nightlight was off, even though I had shut that door and turned the light on beforehand. This is a story my grandma and grandpa told me a while back. I'm originally from a small town in Pennsylvania, and my grandfather was a state trooper for a majority of the time that he lived there before retirement. He took a course on hazardous waste removal. I can't remember his reasoning, but he was trained to be a guy in a hazmat suit who took toxic or irradiated waste away from certain locations. One night, while he and my Nana were asleep, he violently jolted straight up to a sitting position in his bed, still asleep. He pointed to a chair in the corner of his room and said to my Grams, who had been awoken by his movement, "Mary Lou, he's sitting right there in the chair. Do you see him?" My Nana was freaked out, so she tried to get him to lay back down in the bed, which took a few minutes, but eventually he was back to sleeping soundly. In the morning, my pop said that he saw Death sitting in the chair in his room staring at him, and he took that as an omen that he was going to die very soon. About 2 months later, an incident at 3 Mile Island occurred, and the police force out there asked my pop's station to send all of his people there who had hazardous waste training to help get it cleaned up. My pop decided to take 2 weeks off and take a trip to Mexico with my mom and uncle because of the dream that he had had. And when he got back, many of the people that he had known at his office had some kind of radiation poisoning that eventually killed them. I don't tell it as well as they do, but I thought it was an interesting story. My wife is a travel nurse, and we've been living here in Gallup, New Mexico for about 3 months now. We actually only have a week left here, and I'm glad. From the first day we arrived, we felt like something was off. We thought maybe it was just being in a new place, though we haven't felt that way in our previous locations, and maybe because the desert is so radically different from what we're used to. Just a little bit about Gallup. The demographic here is a majority Navajo with some Zuni and Hopi people as well. Gallup is landlocked by these 3 reservations, and the nearest city is Albuquerque, which is about 2 hours away. Now, despite what I just mentioned, being a non-native here in Gallup is not a big deal at all. There's no radical tension issues that we've experienced during our stay. In fact, we've really liked the people we've met here. Yet there is a burning feeling inside of me, like I shouldn't be here, and that we need to leave. And my wife told me that she feels the same thing. As for psychics and feeling negative energy and all that stuff, I personally think it's probably just a bunch of hooey. That's not what I'm saying here. This is more like an instinct that we need to leave and not renew the contract here. And it is only in Gallup. We stayed in Ruidoso a few years ago and loved it there. We have traveled to many places surrounding Gallup and felt fine, but as soon as we came home from the trips, there was that feeling of something being not right. This happened many years ago, so I don't remember many details, but the experience still feels vivid. It is important to be mentioned that the bedroom where I was has a view to the backyard and the kitchen. So, my story took place at my previous home when I was 10. I was alone with my sister, who was 4 at the time, but later my parents came home after Mass. The TV was on and showing a comedy program, but I wasn't very interested. After some time, I noticed what I thought was a person in the corner of my eye. But at a second glance, I realized it wasn't exactly a person. It was a child with curly hair. The silhouette resembled that. And my reaction was nothing but freak out. I was losing my mind, thinking about going to find out what it was or call someone. My sister was sleeping, so she didn't know about it until I told my parents. After some minutes, I managed to calm myself down and wait in that room until my parents came home. Nobody believed me at that moment. During those years, we didn't have any cameras or smartphones. Some years later, I found out about shadow people. And my experience fits with the stories told. I don't know what to think about that, but always remember that day, even after I moved out. It is not uncommon for me to have dreams about shadow people, or to have sleep paralysis. On this particular night, I had a dream about a red marble, and that an entity was tied to this said marble. I felt that I had to protect this marble and keep it away from people who were trying to get it. The marble bounced out of my hand, and I told the entity to roll it back to me, which it did. Here is the weird part. I remember in my dream picking up the marble, but all of a sudden I was staring up at the ceiling. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see a shadow person approaching, and it started to lean over me, looking down. At this point, I have no idea if I'm awake or if I'm dreaming, but I remember saying over and over again, "Leave, leave, leave, leave." But the voice started to sound deeper and deeper, and not like mine at all. My boyfriend sleeping next to me shook me awake, and I sat up, calmed down, and went back to sleep. In the morning, I asked what had happened, and he said that I was talking in my sleep, and that I had said a sentence that was all jumbled, so he couldn't make out what I was actually saying. This made me feel weird, because if I did sleep talk, I would have thought it would have been one word, over and over. I remember in my dream feeling uneasy and scared. Does this sound like I was visited? Or was it just a really bad case of sleep paralysis? Edit. I also forgot to mention that I told my mom about the dream, and what time that it had happened, and she said that she had had a terrible dream and woke up screaming around that same time. We sleep on different floors, so I didn't hear her do this, but she doesn't remember her dream. I was a sergeant in the U.S. Army and getting out from the military when President Bush ordered more troops into Iraq in 2003. I had just returned home into Austin, Texas when I was called into my local National Guard unit at Camp Mabry and told that I was being recalled to the Army, but the unit was already tasked out to deploy to Iraq. I was not part of their unit yet, so the commander offered to give me a waiver to deploy with a government contractor, Halliburton, in Houston. I knew that I would make more money as a contractor, so I took the offer. Not long after arriving in Kuwait at Camp Doha, I began working with the operations team overseeing logistics affairs. We would oversee the daily convoy of supply between Kuwait and Baghdad, a route riddled with IED incidents, small arms skirmishes, and almost constant breakdowns of Army and civilian vehicles. Because I was an SAW gunner in the 1st Infantry Division while in active duty and was technically still in the Guard, I was often in the convoys manning a mounted weapon that accompanied the mostly civilian convoys. During these runs, we had a few strange encounters in an area south of Baghdad, known then as Camp Babylon. Occupied by French troops, but then designated an archaeological site for obvious reasons, Camp Babylon was set up in the area that was said to be originally inhabited by the famous Tower of Babel. Indeed, there were ruins there that did look like a massive structure once stood at that spot. I had 2 strange incidents happen to me while passing through there. The first incident seems to be a bit benign, but sets the mood for the second. We were passing through Camp Babylon in the afternoon one day when our convoy took small arms fire. The SOP at the time, standard operating procedure, was to stop the convoy and return fire. This was because in the past, such incidents ended up being a long gunman attempting to scare the convoy into running into IEDs on the road. Because of this, the standard operating procedure changed to stop the convoy, dismount, and return fire. While engineers looked for explosive devices on the road, we scanned the horizon for enemies. Nothing. They most likely fled immediately. However, the ruins around Camp Babylon were alive with shadow figures that seemed to move about the area. Several times we would spot the figures, but they would instantly disappear. A contractor lying beside me with his weapon commented, "How odd that we were in the shadow of Babel and fighting the supernatural." I didn't respond, but knew that he was a 32nd degree Mason who was really into the arcane aspects of Babylon, etc. I didn't feel at the time that much was supernatural, but certainly did see the shadowy and bizarrely small figures dart about the structures. Once the road was deemed clear, we continued on to Baghdad. The second incident occurred about a month later. At this point, the weather in southern Iraq and Kuwait had turned quite cold at night. During this encounter, we had just completed the supply run to Baghdad and were returning back to Camp Doha in Kuwait when a vehicle in our convoy broke down. Once again, we found ourselves right at Camp Babylon. While the Army mechanics took a look at the vehicle and the rest of us took up fighting positions around the area, strange things began to occur. It started with a strange light bobbing in the desert. Thinking it was a person with a flashlight, we used night vision goggles to watch. It was simply a glowing ball of light moving toward a set of ruins. After initial contact with the light, a few of us had moved forward away from the convoy to see what the source was. After seeing it was self-contained and not a person, we were a bit alarmed. Then we all heard a sound that I will never forget. A long wailing began from one of the ruined structures and foundations not far away. It sounded like a woman in agony mixed with loneliness. On and on the sounds went while we huddled in the cold and dark, wondering what the hell we were listening to. With our night vision goggles equipped, we used our flashlights to spot the ruins. If you've ever done this, you'll know that a normal flashlight with NVGs looks like a massive beam of light. We scoured the area, but no source of the wails or the ball of light were seen. About this time, we were told via radio that the vehicle was repaired and ready to roll, so we decided to return to the convoy. I was slinging my SAW over my shoulder when I noticed my contractor partner was staring at the ruins in horror. He was frozen. I shook him and he snapped out of his stupor, quickly leaving the area with the rest of us. Once we were back at the camp and it was pleasantly daylight the following morning, several of us were chatting about the encounter at Camp Babylon before our daily operations briefing. It was then that I remembered the terrified expression on the face of the contractor, so I asked him about it. He was still obviously traumatized by the event, but managed to explain that as we were leaving our position on the sandy hill, he saw a tall, black figure standing beside the ruins. It was watching us as we were looking for it. He said that he felt an instant wave of despair hit him and thought that he was going to die. He didn't even remember leaving the area. His next memory was in the Humvee, headed back to Kuwait. I now write non-fiction books about haunted places for Llewellyn Publishing and have visited hundreds of reputedly haunted spots. But I'll never forget the wailing figure at the ruins of Babel. It's also worth noting that when I related this story to some of our Pakistani employees at Camp Doha, they were also quite terrified. One of them, a translator we called Ardi, said that we had encountered a jinn, or a damned spirit, and that we were lucky to be able to tell the tale. I agree. Last night I was laying in bed trying to sleep. My room is already a nice, cool temperature due to my air conditioner. However, it feels as though out of nowhere the temperature drops 10 more degrees. I find this a bit strange, but I don't really mind it. Then suddenly, I feel what I think is a touch, like something is touching me around my neck and chest, as well as pressure building on those areas. I simply try not to ignore it and go to sleep. The cold and sensations of touch are a mere annoyance at this point, but that's when I saw it. I looked over my bed to the door, and there it was. A large, lanky shadow figure standing there with yellow eyes. It was only there for a second, but it still managed to scare me. Luckily, I was able to sleep, and as a precaution, I now have a bowl of salt in my room, as I hear it repels evil spirits and possibly demons. I was wondering if anyone could offer their thoughts or an explanation on a paranormal experience that I had as a child. When I was 11, my younger sister passed away from a very sudden death. Months before this incident, I had a vision in the middle of the night that I had never made sense of until recently. I had woken up and saw a floating orb of white light in my room. Inside of it was a young child, around 4, maybe 5 years old, the same age as my late sister, with short hair, wearing a Victorian-style nightgown. I came close to it and stared at it for a minute or two, and then went back to sleep. The next day, I was filled with overwhelming anxiety and the feeling of someone's presence in the house. Only years after this vision and the death of my sister have I thought that this could possibly be some sort of omen or warning of her death.